Well, welcome everybody to our event. As I always joke, it's a very un-New Orleanian thing for the Center for the Study of New Orleans to start promptly on time. But, you know, old habits die hard. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Justin Nystrom. I direct the Center for the Study of New Orleans here at Loyola University. We're really excited about tonight's program, a subject matter that actually I know very little about myself. The genesis for this evening tonight began when I read Jeff Asher's really great piece in the Gambit Blueprint for Reducing Murder in New Orleans. And I said, God, we got to get this guy at Loyola to talk because this is some really good stuff. And then I started following him on Twitter. And in between this sort of dreamy Saints tweets and all these statistics about crime, I thought, wow, you know, this is really, really hard-hitting stuff. I love data. And I'm a historian, and I use a lot of data in my own work. And so I really appreciate what he does, bringing this sort of rationalized argument to what is often a very passionate discussion. So tonight's program, Crime in the Crescent City, is part of an ongoing series engaging the city's most pressing civic concerns. If you were with us in the last couple of months, we had a mayoral forum on the built environment and living in New Orleans, which was very heavily attended. We had a really wonderful program and co-sponsored with the environment program. My colleague Eric Hardy is here in the audience. And we looked at life by the drop, water in New Orleans, and a topic that is, of course, very much near and dear to many New Orleanians' hearts right now, and sadly very near to their cars parked in the street. So within a month, New Orleanians will select a new mayor, an already historic event because it will be the first woman to ever serve in the post. But what new policies will this future administration pursue, and will they be the ones that guide our city to a more peaceful and prosperous future? It is my hope that the experts gathered here tonight might offer all of us a fuller picture of what that might entail. The panelists tonight gather in the spirit of the Center for the Study of New Orleans motto, which is asking critical questions of a vital city. Our moderator tonight is one that is known to many of the students here, is Ray Taylor. She is the chair of Loyola's Criminology and Justice Department. Dr. Taylor's research and teaching interests include intimate partner violence and other violent crimes, societal and organizational responses to violent crime, and social inequalities. And we're very happy to have her here tonight. Our first guest is Jeff Asher, who is a crime analyst and a consultant based here in New Orleans. Some of you may follow Jeff's Twitter feed literally at Crimealytics, which is, for those of you keeping score at home, CRIMEALYTICS, which is a Twitter neologism. Or have read his pieces on WWL or Nate Silver's 538. But of course, the most talked about piece recently, I think, has been his piece in Gambit, a Blueprint for Murder Reduction in New Orleans. Jeff has lived his entire life within 3 miles of Lakeview, and with the exception of a brief stint in Washington, D.C., and is an inveterate Saints fan who, as I speak, is probably calculating the possibility of a Saints return to the Super Bowl. Our next guest is Melissa Sawyer. She's the co-founder and executive director of the Youth Empowerment Project, and I've been hooked up with a really wonderful cloisonne pin tonight from this organization. She came to New Orleans originally as part of Teach for America, and of course in this capacity she learned quite a bit about the challenges that youth in the city face. This experience, along with postgraduate work, formed the genesis of the YEP in 2004. The Youth Empowerment Project is now the largest and most comprehensive organization in the New Orleans region that addresses the needs of underserved, court-involved, and out-of-school youth. And I might add that tonight, of course, they were very much involved in the Night Against Crime, so I'm doubly happy that Melissa made the effort to come here for us tonight. Our last guest, but not least, is not Flozell Daniels Jr., who could not be with us tonight. But I'm very excited to have Darren Aldridge with us, who is a native of New Orleans, Central City neighborhood. He is here to share his unique perspective on our topic through the eyes of someone who's been through it in a far less hypothetical way than our other guests. He is the 100th graduate of the Youth Empowerment Program and is today a full-time instructor at YEP, where, as he says, he wears a lot of hats. At this point, I would like to turn the discussion over to the experts. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Nystrom. I was sharing with our panelists, I've had the privilege of seeing them speak in a number of contexts, so to sit at this table with you is quite an honor. And I thought we would start off by giving each of them 5 minutes or so to kind of just overview, and then I've got a handful of questions to get the important information out, and then we'll get to the most important part, which is your questions. So we'll start with Jeff.
Yeah, thank you all for having us. Excited to sit with you all on this. Yeah, my name is Jeff Asher. I'm, as Justin said, a native New Orleanian. You missed that I actually had 4 years at the University of Texas, as well as 7 years in DC. And so I was in DC. I spent a year, 2 years getting my master's degree, worked for the Defense Department for a year, and then the CIA for 5 years, and was trying to move home. And you know, I don't know how many of you are natives, but when you're born here, you get a little chip that's implanted in you, and it has this like salmon-like reflex that you need to return home. And so I felt the need to return home. It corresponded with my Saints season tickets, getting off the season ticket waiting list. So it was just an opportunity to come home and raise a family and be a New Orleanian. And living in DC, I had a skill set that I felt was basically taking complex problems, thinking about them, writing about them, and analyzing them. And it's a skill set that I don't think New Orleans does particularly well for most of its civic problems, with an especially strong emphasis on not doing it well with crime. And so just sort of having the opportunity to think about crime, analyze crime, and once you have data, once you have analysis, once you understand a problem, you can then begin to assess your policy options and assess whether the policies and programs that you have in place are working. And I was fortunate enough that NOPD was willing to hire me as a crime analyst. I did that for 2 years and then went to do my own thing. And so I've been doing that for the last 3 or so years, 2.5 years. And the majority of what I do is trying to understand 100% of New Orleans crime and why does everything happen. And most of it is focused on gun violence, because gun violence is sort of our city's historic shame. It's the thing that I think separates New Orleans from other cities that just have normal crime problems, if you put normal in air quotes. And so the objective of my approach, at least, is to understand 100% of it and then be able to assess what policy options we could take at a city level, what policy options we could take at a law enforcement level. And the more I look at it, the more I think about what can we do that we're not doing from a non-law enforcement standpoint. And we've been having several questions in the mayoral campaign about crime in New Orleans, and in general, it's the same law enforcement question, and most of it's about how much budget or staffing NOPD needs. And I think that we don't do a great job of discussing ways that we can impact violent crime and understand violent crime that don't involve law enforcement specifically. And so my aim is largely to find ways and bring that conversation to the forefront. And ideally, if we have a better conversation, it'll lead to better policy. And I've seen chances where I think that's been the case, and I've seen times where I shout from the mountaintops and it doesn't do anything. So I like to think that we're getting there a little bit on violent crime, but we obviously have a long way to go.
Okay, thank you, Melissa.
Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you. I want to give a big shout out to the Asher clan here, who's here to support Jeff. It's good to have also an adopted family. I have to say, they've been really good to Yep, and we truly love them. So, Jeff, glad to see people here supporting them.
Thanks for that.
No, it's truly an honor to be here. And again, I'm so glad that you all are going to have the opportunity to listen to Darren just share his story. I think it's really important that we hear firsthand from some of the struggles and the challenges, and too often we don't have dialogue and conversations, I think, with people people who are most directly impacted themselves and within their families. And so again, it's an honor, and I thank you for coming last minute, and I'm sure Flozell does too. But just, yeah, so a little about YEP and how we started. I did come down here in the late 90s. I did Teach for America. I taught at Booker T. Washington High School. I was quickly overwhelmed with the amount of inequity and the violence in the schools and the violence that our young people were dealing with in terms of incarceration, but also in terms of homicides and young people who were then dropping out of school or becoming incarcerated. I guess I should probably say I grew up in Canada, and so my first exposure to the United States was New Orleans, and it was a pretty different context and culture, to say the least. And so I have to say that I kind of bring my Canadian lens to a lot of this work, where we don't have as many guns, we don't have the same issues that we do have in this entire country. I then went back to the Harvard Graduate School of Education, focused on supporting at-risk adolescents and doing urban education reform. But had promised my kids that I'd come back to New Orleans, and really felt like we had a responsibility, that I had a responsibility, because of what I'd seen, because of what I'd experienced, because of the stories I'd heard, but also because of the dearth of programs in our community, to try to come make a difference. So from 2001 to 2003, I was a part of the Juvenile Justice Project of Louisiana. A team of 6 of us were traveling around the state trying to help reform the juvenile prison system. Also tried to help release children from secure facilities. Back then, Louisiana was notorious for human rights abuses against children who were incarcerated. Oftentimes, kids were locked up 6, 7, 8 years, sometimes 3, 4 hours away from home, not getting mental health services, education, vocational treatment, sometimes not seeing their families. So again, it was a really heart-wrenching, very archaic sort of system. We were really good at helping kids to come out of jail, helped reduce the juvenile prison population by about 1,000, from about 2,000 to 1,000. But sadly, we kept losing kids to street violence in New Orleans when they came home, or to the criminal justice system. And that was really the genesis of YEP. YEP started in 2004 in the wake of the Juvenile Justice Reform Act of 2003. I think this is important right now. We were the first reentry program in the state of Louisiana working with children. But I think as we're thinking about justice reinvestment and what we're hearing, and you're probably hearing these words, and maybe some of you are more familiar than others at the state level, about we're trying to reduce our prison population, we're trying to save money, and 70% of those savings are to go back to the community. Where we fell short with the Juvenile Justice Reform Act in 2003 was that reinvestment didn't ever happen. So I would just urge you all to really pay attention, to make sure that we are on top of the ball, and that we are holding our legislators and our policymakers responsible and accountable for ensuring that those dollars really do follow the people who are being released from prison, both from a prevention and intervention and a reentry standpoint. Because if we take our eyes off that money, I would just hate to see where we are in the juvenile justice system, where there has been no reinvestment of funds to help provide services to young people who need them. Sort of fast forward to today, we are the largest, most comprehensive organization in the city, focusing on a group of young people termed Opportunity Youth. That's young people 16 to 24, disconnected from school and from work. But we do provide an array of services to children as young as 7, up through 24 and beyond. And the reason I say beyond is that we have a huge challenge with adult illiteracy in this community. And so we have an adult education program called No Play in New Orleans, providing literacy to all youth. Actually, we had our citywide high school equivalency graduation in this exact room in May, and it's a beautiful day. But we don't say no to any adult learners who want to come back and work on their basic literacy or their high school equivalency, really looking at the correlation between low educational attainment and criminal justice involvement. That's really how we started into the educational work, and it's something that we take really seriously. So again, I'll get a little bit more into details later, but YEP's work really covers the spectrum. We run 11 programs that consist of mentoring, enrichment programs, job training, employment programs, as well as education. And I think the greatest testament to our work are our young people themselves. And I'll then hand it off to Darren, who makes us all look good and who we're so proud of.
Thank you, Ms. Melissa. How y'all doing? My name Darren Aldridge once again. I was born and raised right here in New Orleans, Louisiana. And once again, thank y'all for having me on today's panel. It's an honor and a blessing to be here. I was actually working Night Out Against Crime tonight. I was coaching our basketball team. We just got us a little basketball team, a 6 weeks program we done every Friday. The boys have a basketball game from, it's 6th grade to 9th grade. So I was actually out there doing that, and I got the phone call from Miss Melissa about the panel, and I was like, sure, I'll come do it, because I'm always open up to talking to the community about, things like this. Once again, I'm Darren, like I said. How I started with YEP, in 2009. I was reported to come to YEP through a judge, Ms. Robin Pittman. I said the K through 12 system failed me, as a young man growing up, a young black man growing up in New Orleans, it was hard. My mother was a single mother, raising 4 kids. She was struggling, At the age of 14, Hurricane Katrina came. And from that point on, my rough life started. And, I was moving from state to state, city to city, school to school, just couldn't get right with education nowhere, which leads me to being in the streets, an opportunity youth that was just in the streets, stuck with no mentor, no guidance, no positive role model whatsoever in my life, So I was just hanging around with my peers. My peers was my, role models. And I just got in a little trouble, I went to jail for a few months, and just talking to my judge, man, she's a great woman. Just talking to her, she's seen a lot of potential in me that I didn't see in myself, Just talking to her every day, going to a courtroom, and just being there to hear somebody see something in me that I don't see in myself. It wanted me to do better for myself, It motivated me in sort of way, So when I made like 18, 19 years old, I became a father. And from that moment right there, when I had my first son, I knew that I needed to do something, to better my life and so that he could have a better life in the future, So she introduced me to the Youth Empowerment Project, and from the moment I walked in the doors, I just felt like, I was at home because I got all the wraparound service from all the, directors and the teachers and the staff that was in the program. I just felt like this is where I'm gonna start at. This is where I'm gonna crawl. They say you gotta crawl before you walk. This was my stomach grounds where I needed to, get up off my butt and do what I gotta do to be a father for my son. And I mean, when I first walked in the doors, I felt like it was hard at first trying to get a GED, trying to work, trying to do community service hours, trying to take care of my son. It was real hard, but I had YEP on my back, They stayed consistent with me. They stayed in touch with me. They kept me focused. They kept me motivated. They kept me doing things that I wanted to do. And it was just a great feeling from that point on. And I knew that, if I could do it, every young brother in my neighborhood probably can do it, but they have to see it to believe it. So I was like, I'm tired of, seeing my family members going to jail, tired of seeing them getting murdered to the streets and things like that. I ain't want to be the next brother, to be locked up for a long time or to be dead in the ground. So I just wanted to open my eyes and do things different so that way I can show them and teach them the way. And if I talk to 1,000 kids and one kid turns his life around, that's good on my end, and that's really why I got into the field of wanting to be like a mentor to these young brothers in the neighborhood, because I know I was stuck out there in the streets. I had no help. I had no hope, at least that's what I thought, and I know some of these same brothers want to get out but don't know how to get out. It's like they stuck, they caught up in a maze. And the only way that they can get out is if people like me, myself, and, the people on this panel, just come together and do what we've been doing, trying to do for the past few years. Is like taking it one day at a time, and one child at a time, because it's like, it's crazy that, I growed up in this negative, I should say, community, because I was born and raised in the projects, and it was real rough, and just to overcome that and to look back at some of the other people that I'm working with, the younger kids that I'm working with, I see that there's really a need, for positive role models in this community. And so that's when I just wanted to work and get back, into the field of, giving back to these brothers. So I obtained my GED. I was actually the 100 GED graduate. Yep. Thanks to YEP, I obtained my GED. And then I started mentoring. I was 19, going on 20. I started mentoring at an alternative school. I was mentoring guys that was like a year or 2 years under me. And just the feedback I got from their parents, it was just awesome, like amazing. Like, you're doing a great job with these guys. My son really looks up to you. And from that point on, I knew that this is where I need to be at. This is where I need to be at, giving back, to my community, helping my young black brothers, do things in a positive way, because sometimes they don't always see the light at the end of the tunnel. We always get caught up before we can really show who we are, and then people notice our talents when we behind bars. So, for me to just be here in their life and to work with them and to do all the things I do with them in the community is just a blessing and an honor to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow. So the first question I have was inspired by something that I read on Friday in The Advocate, in an article titled "New Orleans Murder Rate Shows Improvement." And I thought, it does? And the authors conclude, we're moving in a good direction with regard to the city's murder rate. Rather than calling an about face and fighting violent crime, we would be much better suited if our next mayor built upon the successes of the outgoing administration and led us forward to an even lower level of murder in the city. So Jeff, I imagine you in particular might take issue with many of the claims in the article, as I did as a criminologist, especially given our 2017 violence numbers so far. But further, I think it might be important for us to start tonight by understanding exactly how violent New Orleans really is. And as a crime analyst, it seems like you spend almost all of your time doing this. So we probably need to get you some help. But then I wonder if for tonight, can you sum up for us how violent New Orleans is? Help us sort of contextualize this.
Yeah, I don't know if there's any way to get the slides up.
They were up just
They were
a
up.
second ago, as you predicted, but then they went.
There we go. All right. Yeah, so I don't know if any of you saw this article in The Advocate. I brought my pointer and everything all prepared. I don't wholly disagree with the conclusion from the article, which is basically that we've got some good things going in terms of violence reduction. I do think the way they arrived at that conclusion is flawed, and there's, if you look in the details of where we are relative to the last few years, I think there's a lot more murkiness in terms of where our current direction is. Here I went back to 1972, and I started at 1972 because that was the last year, or the first year where New Orleans had 150 or more murders. So that's 44 straight years with 150 or more murders for New Orleans, which New Orleans is one of 8 cities. We're the only city of our size that has that distinction. The only cities under 1 million people that have that distinction are New Orleans, Detroit, and Baltimore. So it's certainly not an impressive distinction to have. Part of the problem with the way that the authors approached their look at New Orleans' murder rate is that they started in 2006, which you've got right here. What I did is I took murders by month and did an approximate murder rate per 100,000. And so if you start in 2006, New Orleans' murder rate was largely driven by the fact that there were 200,000 people here. So the city shrunk by, 260,000 people almost overnight. And so the city's murder rate was, in 2006, 2007, and 93 and 94 was arguably the highest murder rates ever recorded for an American city. So if you start in 2006 and you compare to today, things looks good. But if you were to sort of assess the progress of the Saints, you wouldn't start with 1981 where they went 1 in 15. You would be more interested in how they're doing relative to the year they won the Super Bowl or other years where you would sort of see success, which is not to sort of belittle the concept of murder and the seriousness of the subject, but from a pure data analysis perspective, starting in 2006 is sort of misguided or not necessarily an honest approach to the problem. So if you look at it from pure number of murders, I think it paints a picture of, we certainly had a spike in murders in the 90s to horrific levels. 1994, we had over 430 murders, which led to a murder rate of something like 84 per 100,000. So we're basically half of where we were in 1994. But for the most part, New Orleans has the distinction of having relatively stable number of murders. If you can look at this last point at the end, that little blip right there is 208 murders between July 1st, 2016 and June 30th, 2017. That would be the most number of murders in any given year since Katrina. So in the last year, or the last 18 months, we've had a spike in murders, which led to a pretty serious increase in violent crime in New Orleans. So when you're talking about what is the progress of the city right now, yes, it's down from the 90s. It's significantly lower than where it's been, but we've had a significant rise in gun violence. Third chart I wanted to show is just the red line is the number of shooting victims over 365 days, and the blue line is the number of shooting incident over 365 days. And what you see is basically from mid-2016 to mid-2017, we averaged about 2 people shot per day. That put us online with Baltimore, which has been in the news as having a horrific amount of gun violence. It actually put us in line with where Chicago in terms of the rate of shooting victims per 100,000. The difference is that shooting victims have a tendency to, shootings in New Orleans have a tendency to be more fatal than in Chicago. So when you talk about the direction of the city relative to the 90s, I think, yes, there are a lot of things. When you talk about the last year, year and a half, it's really a lot more concerning that we had this spike in gun violence, and it does, the last few months have been much slower. Can't really explain why that is, but we had a spike that was sort of unprecedented in terms of our recent history in gun violence. The other thing I want to draw attention to is this dip right here, which is important because right around here is when NOLA for Life started. And you can see NOLA for Life starts, the city begins to do a lot of anti-gang measures, and there was a significant drop, 20% drop in gun violence in New Orleans, which is significant. It shows that a policy almost certainly had an impact on New Orleans gun violence. And so when the authors conclude that there are things that we can take away from this administration's approach to gun violence, I think the data clearly bears that out. And there's lots of aspects of their approach that we need to critically think about and see what we can do going forward. But at the same time, within 6 months to a year of those policies starting, they had largely worn off. And so as we think about gun violence going forward and how we're going to approach this from a big picture policy standpoint, we really have to consider what worked, why it worked, and how we can replicate the successes while also maintaining them.
All right, thank you. So before we can effectively fight crime and ultimately reduce or hopefully end violence, because we would all love to work ourselves out of a job, I know, you have to understand the roots of violence. And I think we miss that mark a lot. And Darren and Melissa, your work really focuses on the roots. So what do each of you see as the roots of violence in New Orleans, the root causes?
So, for me, like I say, I work right where I grew up in Central City, not too far down the street from where a lot of violence, occurring at. I think the problem starts for some of these guys is at home. Some of these guys have mouths to feed. Some of these guys have roofs to provide for, homes and families. And I just think that it starts in a community where poverty is at its all-time high, and it's like, if they don't have, they have to go get it, And with this violent piece, it's like, it seems to me it's coming like kids younger and younger are learning and knowing a lot about, street violence. And like I said, it starts at home, because if I can have a 9 or 10-year-old come up to me and ask me, what's such and such as a gun or such and such, and I ask them, well, how you know that? Oh, my big brother, my big cousin. That means it starts at home. They family members, they seeing it a lot. A lot of this rap music they listen to, a lot of these things that they see on TV, it's really the real reason. But I think, like, with the older guys, it's just retaliation, Problems that been going on in different family and different homes for years. I don't think nobody wakes up and say, I want to go commit a crime or I want to be violent to someone, I just think things happen in their life where it's the wrong place at the wrong time sometimes. Like I said, yeah, it's day by day, you have to deal with it day by day, and each person takes his own toll on what they're gonna do in their life, but just like the community is like a sponge. If you're living in a community to where it's positive and you seeing all beautiful trees, palm trees, and everything look all good, then that's what you're gonna live like. But if you get off your school bus and you're in the 7th, 8th grade and you see older guys on the corner and hanging out front of liquor stores, smoking marijuana, doing whatever, then it's gonna soak you in. As you get older, that's what you see, that's what you do. So that's where the violence part come in at, everything they see in their community, everything they see in their home, everything they see on TV, everything they see their peers do. It'll make you, it'll make you. If you don't have no positive people in your life, it'll make you, take the negative route. And then anything will happen,
Yeah, I think, again, Darren sees this every day, as do I. When we started YEP, one of the things we kept seeing was that even though our young people had been incarcerated and away from home, they were coming back into the same neighborhoods and communities. And oftentimes, maybe a cousin or a brother had been killed or had been incarcerated, and therefore they were ultimately brought into something that was actually not even about them. But I think there is a lot of retaliation, or just sticking with family. And I think, again, that is how a lot of these dynamics work. A lot of it is people are hurting. There's not enough mental health support. We're still working to fix our schools. There's still a lot of children who are not making it through schools. We're still seeing a lot of young people come through our doors who have either been expelled or have been incarcerated or just not making it, and so they really need more viable options. I think there's just, for me, and I've been doing this now for almost 20 years, it is concerning because it is cyclical, and now I'm even starting to see kids of kids who I worked with. And again, I've been in Central City for this whole time, although we work with young people across the city, and there's definitely a sense of hopelessness and not knowing what to do and where do we go and how do we access help. And just because you have services, if you don't feel comfortable, if you don't feel safe, if you don't feel welcome, if they're not easy to access, you've been told no so many times, you've maybe failed so many times, you're so angry, you're angry at yourself, you're angry at your situation, you're angry at what your neighborhood looks like, you're angry at what you don't have. And I think that's really hard, especially for children who are 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 to process. We don't have enough viable economic opportunities for our young people. It's not all about jobs, but the level of poverty and the sort of desperation that folks have to be the primary breadwinner, or to at least have a clean school uniform, or to make sure lights are on in the house, or taking care of a brother or sister is something that's very, very serious and very real. I think, too, that New Orleans is a very small community. And I think one of the things that we see, and we can talk about this a bit later, but after Katrina, and I remember a couple of young men we adored who we worked with, they had tattoos in their head. They got them done when they evacuated to Houston after Katrina with the ward that they were from. They lived in public housing. The ward they lived in was completely flooded. The public housing unit was closed down. So then they were moved to an uptown project where they were then in the 3rd ward. So that would be a 3. But again, they are representing a different neighborhood, a different community where they're not familiar, where potentially there has been this sort of like family violence or other sort of violence that's happened. Again, these are conditions beyond the control of children. In some ways, these are unintended negative policy consequences that I think folks haven't thought of. But we, again, are such a small city that geographically there's not really anywhere for you to go. And I think that a lot of times our kids, if your cousin, your brother, someone is killed or is caught up, you either have to go in or you basically are trying to hide from what could very well be your predicament. And we see, unfortunately, this happen over and over and over again. And a lot of times these kids are 13, 14, 15. And it is heartbreaking. And I think that's why we need programs like YEP, and we need to invest in interventions, because law enforcement alone, and this is a cliche, we're not going to incarcerate our way out of this. And it's really going to take an investment in our children and in our community, matched with the investment we need in well-trained, culturally competent, supportive law enforcement strategies.
Okay, you mentioned hopelessness and culture. We know that we have this dubious distinction in New Orleans as a murder city, and we have persistently high rates of violence that I think does lead to a sense of hopelessness among our citizens, wondering, is this ever going to improve? But between Massachusetts and DC and Canada and Texas, you've been around and you've done this work for a while. Is New Orleans unique in our culture? Do we have a subculture of violence? Is there something unique in your experience and your travels about New Orleans, or are we consistent with other violent cities such as Baltimore and Detroit and other high homicide rate cities?
So in terms of the actual data, I would defer to Jeff, if you want to go from a data standpoint. In terms of what I would say, I think, again, there's cultural variances to this no matter what city you're in. There's going to be some differences. There's different things that work. Some cities are going to have more formalized gangs. Others have more neighborhood or like family units. So I think, again, there's definitely going to be differences in terms of where you are. I do think in New Orleans is that, I say we have very large city problems in a very small community. We have limited amounts of resources. We have one Fortune 500 company. Our young people live in very socially isolated communities where if you don't know job creators, if you don't know employers, this is a relationship-based city, and it's really hard to get out of that if you don't have people who are willing to say, I'm going to open my Rolodex, I'm going to knock on this door, I'm going to get you this first job, I'm going to make that happen. And I think that that is exceptionally stifling, and our young people know that, and they feel like we are a part of this part of New Orleans. There's another part of New Orleans that sometimes we see, but we feel so disconnected. That's not our city. And so I think that that's something we definitely need to think about. I think that if we look at urban America and what's gone on, yeah, we are the incarceration capital of the world. That is horrific. And also, what are the implications of that on families? 94,000 children in Louisiana have a parent who's been incarcerated. So we're also destroying families by not ensuring that we are supporting our children and our families. And so I think we really have to look at all of the factors at play. A lot of them are policy issues. A lot of them go back many, many, many years in terms of what's been created and where we are. But a lot of it is giving young people nurturance and love and support and opportunities. And I think sticking with young people. I think a lot of times we want young people to be ready to go. Oh, you need to be ready to go take this job. Well, if I've never had a job, I've never had expectations, I'm feeling crummy about myself, I might not be ready, but I need you to stick and stay. I need you to wait for me for when I am ready. And I think a lot of times we're like, okay, well, you didn't want help, so we're just going to move on. And I think we need to really recognize that that's not how adolescents work or grow, and young people are adolescents until they're 25 years of age in terms of brain development. And so we have to be patient, we have to be thoughtful, and we have to make sure that we're really creating programs that are truly accessible.
Yeah, I think, I agree with everything Melissa said. I think from a data perspective, our uniqueness is sort of in the persistence of gun violence as a problem. For the last 24 years, we've led the nation in murder rate 14 times. We've had the top 5 in terms of murder rate every year since 1987. So there's not any city other than New Orleans that has had this persistent problem from not just the last 5 years or 10 years, but it's been a generational problem. It's half century of a problem for New Orleans. And Baltimore and St. Louis and other cities are having murder at higher rates than New Orleans, but I don't think that necessarily excuses the horror of what our murder rate has done to New Orleans for generations. And I think that the fact that we haven't had a break at all in the last half century is what makes New Orleans unique. From a sort of the mechanisms of murder, Jill Leovy wrote a great book of the Los Angeles Times. It's called Ghettocide. And she basically ascribes murder to 2 things. And it's all about Los Angeles, but if you replace every reference to Los Angeles with New Orleans, you pretty much have the same explanation from sort of the big picture drivers of murders. And Leovy talks about, one, the absence of alternative options, which my panel mates have discussed, I think, pretty amply and talked about in good detail, the lack of opportunities and the needs for alternative opportunities beyond incarceration or murder. And the other thing that Jill Leovy points out in Ghettocide is what she calls the absence of a state monopoly on violence, which is essentially if somebody knows with 100% certainty that NOPD is going to make an arrest on a murder, then the likelihood of a retribution, the likelihood of the victim's friends going out there and carrying out the response is greatly diminished. But because in New Orleans we do not have an absence of a state monopoly on violence, NOPD last year solved something like 1/3 of murders. This year, earlier in the year, when we had that horror that started up, they were at about 20% of murders being solved. And even in some of our best post-Katrina years, you're only looking at 50% of murders being solved. And so if you have no other alternatives and you know that it's at best a coin flip that someone's going to catch either you if you do something in retribution or catch the killer, then it greatly increases the likelihood of a retribution killing, and it leads to this cycle that's really difficult to get out of. And so I think of when you think about ways to attack it, it's not just in New Orleans. We're not unique in that those are sort of the angles that you have to attack. And, I'm sorry Flozell couldn't be here, because when he would talk about his son being murdered, he would talk about going places and knowing who did it, and that name being talked about throughout the community, and there was just nothing he could do about it. And he and his friends were all scared of this person. And fortunately, this person was arrested, but that knowing who had done it and that there was just nothing that could be done to get this murder solved, I think fixing that and then fixing the alternatives to escape from essentially the poverty and the educational issues and all of these generational issues. I think that's what we have to do, and I don't think that those steps are necessarily unique to New Orleans. I just think other cities have done a better job of that.
I think it's important to point out too, we're talking about murder because that's for obvious reasons it's the most serious, but following that are all of those other non-fatal violent crimes, right, which are also sky high in our city. Maybe things that were intended to be murders, but the person was saved in the ER or whatever. So the problem is really huge, which brings me to my next question, and that is that the timing of this panel was not accidental. It was purposefully placed by Dr. Nystrom in between the primary mayoral election that we had this Saturday and the general election on November 18th. And violence in our city is obviously a huge concern for all of our citizens. So I know candidates, Cantrell and Charbonnet, have their own plans for reducing violence, but I'm not sure how convinced we are as voters. So I just want to go down, and we'll start with Darren, and just ask each of you, based on your expertise, based on your observations, based on your own experiences, what advice would you give our new mayor about the best approach to effectively reducing violence in our city?
I mean, I would just say, to just try to be out there more. And when I say that, just try to be in the community a little bit more, go out, have more than one night out against crime. Go out and talk to some of these guys in the community, just, talk to some of these families, I mean, just be hands-on. I mean, just be hands-on with them and have answers for any questions they have to offer you, just be hands-on. It's nothing else I can really say, because it'll be hard to try to, give somebody advice on how can we stop crime, how can we reduce this, how can we come up with a plan to do this, because sometimes we could say all those things, but it'll never happen, but sometimes just to see it, just to visual it, to see where these people coming from, and maybe it probably get a better understanding of why all this stuff are going on, and they probably could come up with a plan idea of their own on how to stop it, So just to be out there more and to be in the communities more where these things are happening, just don't be afraid of it, just go out there.
Right.
I say this a lot, but I do firmly believe that budgets are moral documents, and I think that it's important that the next mayor really look at her budget and say, where are we spending our money? If we look at it now, we know a lot's going to public safety, but not a lot's going to Nord C programs, very little's going to youth enhancement programs, very little's going to adult education or early childhood programming, very little's going to mental health or substance abuse reduction programs. I can say from our vantage point, again, we're the largest sort of organization working in this space with vulnerable young people. Less than 4% of our budget comes from city funding. Another large organization working with small children who really are in need of after-school care, nutrition programs, also doing maternal health programs. Less than 1% of their budget comes from the city. So if we're really serious about this, we also have to invest in the prevention and the intervention side. I think something too from Jeff's slide, if we are onto something, we're not going to solve this overnight. We can't just start and stop doing things over and over and over again. I think we have over-politicized crime and crime fighting to a sense where this has to be depoliticized. This is about our future. This is about our community. This is whether or not people want to stay here. This is whether or not people want to come here. It's whether or not people want to have their children here. And we need to make sure that we are not just doing things that are linked towards one political legacy, that it's based in data, and that we are making long-term investments in strategies that can be sustained beyond mayoral transition. And I think too often the concern is if things are working, well, that was his or her plan. We're going to just not do it anymore because I have my own plan. I want to take credit for this. We're not going to solve this in 4 years. And so I think there has to be a level of humility. We do need to use data, and we need to stay the course to make sure that we can actually see some of these interventions through.
Yeah, Melissa stole a little bit of my thunder on that second point. It is nice to be able to say her budget in terms of our next mayor. Nice. I haven't heard that and thought about that, but that's kind of nice. I think that if I were to sort of rephrase the way Melissa said her last point, I would advise the next mayor to embrace the difficulty of the challenge. I think that I would agree with Melissa that we hit on something that works, or through random luck or through 1,000 different circumstances, murder goes down a tiny percent. And I think in the city, we have a tendency to point at the long-term trend of down and declare victory. And I think part of the challenge with murder is that the second that you're celebrating and high-fiving things going down, your luck changes, something else changes, and murder has a tendency to go back up. And if you've declared victory at the down part, then I think that politically administrations tend to have a challenge then in terms of understanding why it's going up and embracing that and figuring out why that is. I don't think anyone is going to blame the Landry administration, just like they shouldn't blame the Nagin administration. And I think most people credit the Morale administration for helping to end the horror of the mid-'90s here. But I don't think anyone expects the mayor to fix everything, as Melissa said, in their 4 years. So I think that there's less. You're not going to be blamed, I think, for trying new things and coming up with new strategies and as I said, embracing the difficulty of the challenge. So I think that the mayor that does that and is honest with the population and doesn't only spew the good while ignoring when things get bad, that's the mayor that's able to embrace the challenge more honestly and come up with solutions that'll work.
That's great. And I think we all have learned from experience, we can't leave it up just to our lawmakers to solve the problems. But that leads me to my next question. One of the things that's so special about the Loyola community, and if any of you have ever been to any other panel that addressed any other social problem, there is always going to be someone in the audience who asks, what can I do? And they mean it, and then they go do it. So the last question that I wanted to ask is how we in the Loyola community, especially students, can get involved and make a difference.
Well, I'm going to give a shout out to Stephanie Hotard, Director of Development, Loyola alum, who is here and is going to hand out cards if you guys are interested in volunteering opportunities or things with us. We do quarterly volunteer orientations. Stephanie can help connect folks. I think for students, I know you'll have crazy schedules. You don't have a lot of money, but if there's some tutoring, if there's some after-school programs, we do a sleepaway camp supporting kids 9 to 12 who are impacted by substance abuse. Darren's a lead counselor, but that's fun if you guys are into camping and outdoor stuff. So I would say, and if it's not YEP, there's so many other really amazing organizations in this community that, it's not a one-size-fits-all. So I would just encourage you to reach out and to become civically engaged. And again, you don't have to save the world. If it's helping one child, if it's reading with one kid for 1 hour a month, if it is donating a little bit that you have to make someone's holiday a little bit nicer, then you're really doing more than your share. And I think that that's what this is going to take, is everyone just saying, hey, I want to do my part to make this city and to make this world a little bit better for those who don't have as much as I have. And I think we do have a responsibility. So I would just encourage you all to get involved, to look for volunteer opportunities. And again, Stephanie's here if you're interested in YEP. And if it's not us, but there's other sort of interests you have, we are well connected in the nonprofit community. And hopefully we can help guide you all towards other organizations who are doing work that maybe is more of an interest to you.
Anything else?
Yeah, I would say be the next Melissa Sawyer. I mean, this is all like her hard work and 13 years or whatever of doing all this. And there's no reason that other organizations and other challenges can't be met. And if I've learned anything from being here and when I started approaching crime, there's data available and no one's writing about it. So I just said I was going to start writing about it. And so I think that this is a neat city because it's a small town. And individuals can have a big impact. And just looking at the city of New Orleans has an incredible repository of data available, and very few people look at it. And there's repositories that I'm like, numbers 1 through 100 that have ever looked at them. And if you have Excel and a computer, you go on and find a problem and think about solutions. And I think building organizations, and YEP is just such an incredible organization. So use them as a model, and that would be my only advice.
Okay. And you're out on the front lines. And we've got all these amazing students. What help do you need?
I mean, I'm willing to take any support and help that's out there to offer that's given, and like Miss Melissa said, just try to, like it could be a few hours out your time, out your day, out the month, to just come by. You don't even have to stop by, if you want to send a little message or something, a card or something to us, that'll be awesome. But, you can stop by the center if y'all want to check out our basketball team, or one of our after-school summer camps, Camp Mariposa programs. I'll be there if y'all have any questions, anything about anything goes on around there. I'll be there to help y'all,
All right, thank you. So what questions do you all have?
Okay, it's on now. Yeah, I'm happy to bring the microphone around. You have questions up here. I selfishly want to ask one myself. We all get into avocations for reasons, and usually there's a moment when we decide to pursue what we do. And I just kind of, for the panel, what was that moment that put you on the path to doing what you're doing? Was there one moment, was there sort of a turning point where you said, you know what, I'm going to jump in with both feet and I'm going to make a difference?
I mean, I remember when I was working with NOPD, I'd obviously sort of started down the path. There was a mother that was murdered, and her 1 or 2 year old daughter, and I have trouble telling the story without choking up, but I'll try. Anyhow, the 1 or 2 year old daughter was in the car, and somebody was near the murder and dropped the child off at the family member's house. And I remember reading the report, and the child kept saying, "My mama," and that was probably 2013 or 2014. I've never forgotten it. I look at Excel spreadsheets and sit in a cubicle all day, but it's humans out there that there's a very human toll of gun violence in New Orleans. And so I would say that that's the moment that whenever I'm like, why am I doing this? Nobody cares. That's the moment that sort of I go back to and think that, okay, this is something that I can put my skill set to and hopefully not have that happen to the next generation.
I think probably for me, there's maybe 2 moments. The first, actually, Darren and I have talked about. I think that we should never normalize burying children and young people. And I buried 3 young people my first year during Teach for America. The first funeral I went to was actually Darren's little cousin. And we didn't know that until 15 years later or what have you. But I have to say that was something for me that's like, we don't have counselors in our schools. We're not even talking about this. We're just going through the motions that these children are literally not safe walking to school. They're caught up in things way beyond their ability to survive and to live. And so for me, it was losing young people. Unfortunately, I've lost far too many. But it was Darren's little cousin who was the first funeral I ever went to when I moved down to New Orleans. I think the second thing for me after Harvard, I'd made a commitment to my kids to come back, and I think I realized that we need talent, we need people to come back who care, and I felt so fortunate to have the opportunity to learn from our young people and their families. And one of my favorite students, I kept trying to reach him. Finally, I got his best friend on the phone. I was in Union Square in New York City, kind of deliberating between staying in Boston or New York or coming down. And his best friend told me that he was in jail for murder, and him and his uncle were in jail together. And I was like, New Orleans needs me more than New York needs me. They need me more than Boston needs me. I have these relationships. I made a commitment. I have a responsibility. And so I still remember that moment, that to me meant that I needed to come back down here and do what I felt I needed to be doing at the time to help do my part to improve the lives of young people in this city.
All right. And for me, it was just, one day I decided to, go in my room and change a shirt I had on. I weighed something on it. And I opened up my drawer and I seen more than 5 to 8 family, cousins, friends, dead pictures on shirts. And I'm like, this is way too many people that I lost, and then being 19 years old, witnessing my son birth, it was just like, I can't let him lose me and I can't lose him. Like, I done lost too many people. When you got more dead bodies on shirts than you have regular shirts, that's a big problem, And that was a moment where I said, like, I had to do something to change myself, to better myself. So that's the moment that stuck with me.
Hi, I want to thank you all for the fascinating and important panel. This has been really great information. I'd like to, you've talked a bit about what programs from one mayor's administration should be continued or not. And I want to know if you could maybe unpack what happened with NOLA for Life. As I understand, it's based on Operation Ceasefire out of Boston, where the belief is that a small number of highly active offenders are responsible for the majority of a city's crime problems. And there's 3 parts to it: the call in with the moral faith leaders, we love you, don't do this. The police say please, or they point out the consequences of this life of crime, and then finally a genuine offer of help. And so Mr. Ashner, you mentioned that it dropped 20%, but then it seemed to wear off. So could you unpack that? Like, what happened? And do you all think that program should be continued?
Yeah, I don't know how much time everybody has, but we might be here a while. I think when you look at NOLA for Life, the main strategy was called GVRS, the Group Violence Reduction Strategy. And the concept was, as you mentioned, it's basically we know that a tiny fraction of the city's population is perpetrating a large percentage of the city's gun violence. And the concept largely had two strategies to it. One was the call-ins, as you mentioned, which was 20 or 30 or 40 identified gang members in a courtroom, and they had been compelled to be there. They were on probation or parole, or they were in jail at the time, and they basically had one side of the room read the riot act and the other side of the room offer services. The other angle was the indictments, which was the city indicted, 15 gangs over the course of 3 years, and the majority of that happened in late 2012 to middle of 2014. And so if you look at the city's strategy, and this is exactly when I was with NOPD, the city largely focused on a couple of hundred gang members. And that tiny fraction of the population, you could look at NOLA for Life as essentially a messaging strategy. So the indictments were a messaging to, you've got 100, 120 indictable people for the federal or state racketeering charges, which are very difficult to do. They take a long time, they take a lot of resources, and there's just there's only so many people that you can indict under these types of charges. And then the call-ins, which are very clearly messaging of, here's the message, we want you to give it out to the street. And so if you think about the city implementing this strategy at gang members in 2013 and 2014, the message got out there. And I think that the chart I showed is pretty clear evidence that the message was heard. But then I think that if you're not offering social services to the degree that you need to, if you run out of people to indict, you run out of people to call in, you essentially run out of gang members, then the messaging wears off. And there's only so many times you can read the riot act, only so many times you can offer social services that maybe don't have quite enough budgetary oomph behind them. And so I think that that's what happened with the city, is that you saw a drop in violence, about a 20% drop in violence, and then after that you saw about a 10% increase in violence to a level that was, we went from averaging 450 shootings from 2010 to 2012 to averaging 400 shootings from 2014 to the middle of 2016, and then something happened in 2016, and as an analyst it freaks me out because I have no idea how to explain it, or I have a couple of wild theories. But so I think that when you think about NOLA for Life as a messaging strategy, that's the part that says, okay, we can develop strategies that can impact gun violence. When you think about NOLA for Life as solely targeting gangs, essentially, or excuse me, the GVR strategy, solely targeting gangs, the data that's available shows that the at-risk population, and gun violence in New Orleans is extremely concentrated, but the at-risk population may be 4 or 5 times the size that the city was initially targeting. And so if you're only targeting a tiny fraction of the small fraction of the at-risk population, then yeah, it makes sense that you can get a one-time powerful message out there that the effect wears off. That's what I think the data says, although it's sort of a soft science here, so other interpretations are, I'm sure, plausible as well.
Yeah, I was Eric Hardy, urban historian here at Loyola. I was also curious about whether or not it was correlational as opposed to causational. Like, how do you really measure that?
So a pair of professors at the University of Cincinnati came down here and did the academic research and basically showed not just the correlation, but a pretty strong causal effect between now they didn't separate the indictments and the call-ins, but they found a very strong causal effect between NOLA for Life happening and specifically gang shootings dropping. When I was with the city, I measured gang shootings at about a third of shootings from 2010 to 2012, and it dropped to about 8 to 10% from 2013 through 2015 when I left. So I don't know what it is now. And I have charts where you can, in the 6th district, which is Central City and Uptown, you can measure the actual arrests of gang members and the firearm discharge reports, so 911 calls for firearms discharge, and you can measure it in 2012 and 2013, and you can see the drop. And then as soon as people stop getting arrested, essentially, you see it sort of trickle back up. So again, that's not causation inherently, but it's really strong correlation there.
Over here.
Mom, Dad?
On my way.
Thank you. I want to thank the panel too. This was very interesting, especially from the personal to the systemic and the statistical. I have a personal story which illustrates all three of those levels also. And it relates mostly to the police department and to the lack of recourse that people have in that system when they're in training as a police officer. My son Patrick is graduated from Tulane with a degree in psychology. He's a lifeguard, a mixed martial artist, a personal trainer, a dog whisperer, and a really good problem solver. And he wanted to do something for the city, and he joined the New Orleans Police Department. When he went to the police department interview, they looked at him and his record, and they asked him if he was a plant from the FBI to investigate the police department. So he graduated at the top of his class in the academy. He did really well in his first tour of field training in the 6th District. They asked him to come back when he finished because they wanted him there. He went to a second rotation and had an unfortunate series of experiences with an incompetent training officer. And he went to his third rotation and ran into the old New Orleans Police Department meeting the new New Orleans Police Department. He ran into a lieutenant who decided that he shouldn't be a New Orleans Police Department recruit, and changed his training scores, and also then went ahead and set up 2 kangaroo courts and had him kicked out of the police department. I filed a complaint with the independent police monitor, talked to the federal judge who's in control of the monitoring system for the police department. Hopefully they would learn something from this experience. They were not interested, said they couldn't help us. I went to the Inspector General, the ACLU. I wrote a letter to the Department of Justice. I talked to reporters. I talked to everybody on the city council. I had 2 confrontations with the mayor. The mayor told me if I didn't like the results of this process that I should sue the city. Unfortunately, everybody who has sued the city in the last 20 years, even if they have won, has never been able to collect anything. So there aren't any lawyers who are willing to sue the city. That's another systemic issue. So my question, well, first of all, I'm going to stop in a minute. There may be other people who want to talk. I'm glad you're all here. I'd like to get your contact information before I leave because I think there's a story here for you. There may be a job with you or graduate school with you. So my son is now very disillusioned with public service, with doing anything in any area to benefit anybody except himself because he feels like he was unjustly a victim of a series of unfortunate events. I am very distraught about what his change in attitude. He's now the bar manager at the Columns Hotel. You probably have met him. Anyway, and he's wondering what the hell to do with his life. So I do want to talk to or contact you or have him contact all 3 of you to talk about that if you're willing to do that. And again, I want to thank everybody for all the interesting information that I gathered.
Thanks.
Well, we have another. Excellent.
So, yeah, is there a correlation yet? Can you draw any conclusions from the fact that we went from, just a huge jail prior to Hurricane Katrina and the levee failures to now they're holding it, at about 1438?
No, I don't.
I guess I would also ask is is there something missing? You know, in other words, you know, you've got the smaller jail, but you don't have the increased services, and you have a police budget, you know, public safety budget that sits at 65%.
Well, I think definitely we could have a whole conversation about, and probably a whole other forum about wraparound services in the jail and the size of the jail. There's certainly no relationship, as far as I'm aware, in terms of the jail size and crime in the city. And if you track the number of arrests and the number of people going to jail, it's largely the minor things that the city has stopped doing. So you're talking about misdemeanor, attachments and things like that, traffic arrests and things like that, that the city should not be in that business. And in terms of 21st century policing, we shouldn't be bringing people to jail and ruining lives over minor squabbles. At the same time, violent arrests have stayed relatively steady. So it's not a problem. I mean, there are lots of issues with percentages and clearance rates of violent crimes, but in terms of reducing arrests and reducing the size of the population, I think that's largely been on the backs of arrests that NOPD should not be making to begin with.
I was just, I guess what I was wondering about is, though, when you shrink the jail size, does that, I mean, I guess you've answered it for me. There isn't a reduction in violence per se.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think those two are correlated. And I think that in general, I try to think about criminal justice and the failures of our criminal justice system statewide and the failures of our crimes fighting strategy, I think, are separate entities. There obviously is some crossover there, but I think that there's a whole different effort that we need to take in terms of improving the criminal justice system. And
I certainly wonder if it, and I'm sorry to take up so many questions, but I'd wonder if it also, though, when you have a smaller jail and you're not incarcerating people for nonviolent offenses and misdemeanors and, you know, the whole thing with marijuana, for instance, that, you know, by not arresting these people, you're allowing people to at least have an opportunity to get a job and employment and so forth.
yeah, I would fully agree with that. And I think that the quicker we can get people, the fewer people that we can arrest overall, and the quicker we can get them out of jail, and without causing ridiculous fees and things like that, I think the better for the city.
And we have to remember, we have a smaller population than we did before the storm, right? So I think we have to take that into account. I think also, if you have a huge number of beds, there is incentive to make sure that they are full. And so I think that we do have to look at policies and practice and how that intersects. And I think that that's something we want to be very cautious of. I think the final point that I would say about that, and this is sort of best practice in juvenile justice, is for the most part, you want to leave kids alone unless they actually need interventions. And then you want to give them as infrequent, limited touches as they actually need. Because the longer you're connected with them, and this is, again, from an adolescent development standpoint, but there's a lot of adolescents who are being held in the Orleans Justice Center right now, is that you have more opportunity for them to make just adolescent mistakes, bump their head. Then you get further and further in the system where you're actually creating this sort of paper trail, or then actually have 2 or 3 offenses, or you're actually seen as a sort of like, lifetime sort of like criminal or career criminal. And so I think as much as possible, we want to leave those kids alone and make sure that we are giving them interventions and wraparound supportive services. I think, but that is part of the failure. Well, and again, I didn't necessarily want to get into the whole NOLA for life, but it became this umbrella that wasn't just about ceasefire. There's maybe 60 different initiatives, but the ones that were not funded but were called partnerships were those that were actually providing services or expected to provide high quality services. And so I think, again, we can't have an expectation that we are going to build the infrastructure in our community to address these needs, so we don't need to rely on incarceration. But if we're not investing in them and we're not investing in them sustainably, we're not actually solving that problem. And so I think, again, we have to make sure that we are at the council meetings, we're looking at the budget, and that we are also making sure we need to invest in programs that are proven effective.
Great. Thank you. We're gonna take one last question for the evening, or here.
First of all, I want to say thank y'all for this panel. It's been great. The mayoral candidates have talked a lot about investing in police. It seems like recruiting and technology. In ways that don't necessarily strike me as very realistic. I'm wondering, Jeff, to hear a little bit more from you on that. And for Melissa and Darren, I'd like to hear from y'all what you think the police department should be doing to improve relationships with and outcomes for opportunity youth?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when you specifically relate the police department size to gun violence, you're looking at, so NOPD lost 30% of its manpower from 2009, 2010 to 2015, 2016, and it's having a difficult time rebuilding. And that's a national trend. No police agency across the country is really growing right now. So I think that the problem with the way that candidates in general have addressed police recruitment is that we're going to hire 300, we're going to hire 500, we're going to hire 700, and you'll be lucky to get 30 to 40 officers, new officers a year. And so when you look at, you lost 400 officers, you can kind of start to do the math that if you want to replace those 400 or 450 officers at 30 to 40 a year, you're looking at a decade before you start to sort of half decade to a decade before you start to really rebuild those capabilities. And so we talk about NOPD's size, and it's not just that NOPD lost officers, it's that they lost these capabilities. The homicide unit went from 43 officers to 29 officers. So that's a 35% reduction. 35% reduction in homicide detectives means fewer cases solved, which means more retribution, and it continues this cycle. So when you talk about ways that officers can be used, you're really talking about a long-term trend. And I think that when we start to think about those issues, I think that we need to take it out of the we're going to do this in one term and think about it in a 10 to 15 year term, because the last thing we want is to reduce our standards, get rid of the consent decree, and all of a sudden have the 90s here again where we're back in a consent decree in 10 years. To the technology question, I think that the challenge is who's going to use the technology. Surveillance cameras, there's evidence that they can work to reduce car theft, reduce vehicle burglary, but the research shows that they only work if you have the officers that are there to look at it and the officers that are there to respond to calls about basically seeing a crime in place. And you also need enough cameras. So if your main responses are we need to respond to murders, we need to respond to robberies, we need to respond to within 3 hours to traffic accidents, then you can't spare the manpower to respond to a car being broken into and pennies being stolen from a dashboard. So they're sort of intertwined in terms of until we solve the manpower problem, we can't solve the technology problem. And also, NOPD had 400 more officers, and we had a murder rate that was first in the country. So manpower is not the solution. I think that manpower and technology can help, but I think that they're very difficult, and their ability to assist in this problem, I think, is much more challenging than people tend to believe. I don't know if that answers your question, David.
I mean, for me, I think the police department, I think they need better training in how to protect and serve in the community that they work in, Because to me, it's like they need to stop being afraid of us, We not here to hurt them or to harm them in no type of way. And I say that to say we could be 5 to 8 individuals hanging out in front of our own door, and you see one cop car just pass you by, and he'll stare you down and look at y'all crazy. And then within 5, 10, 15 minutes later, you have 4 cop cars out there putting us on a car, asking us, what y'all doing hanging out? We just chilling in front of the door. I mean, why that one cop car couldn't stop and communicate with us and talk to us? Why you had to call 15 other officers back here, If you have enough training, with how to protect and serve, then therefore, if you do see all of us, you should be able to get out your car and come holler at us, come talk to us, and ask us what's going on, how y'all doing, without having 15 of y'all pulling up and harassing us and handling us, and they wonder why we don't trust them or we don't want to call them if something do happen. Like you said, if somebody breaking my car, I just have to deal with it on my own, because if I call the police, when they come out and see who called us was broken into, 9 times out of 10 ain't nothing gonna happen. So it's like you make us not want to call you, and it's like they're afraid of us when they shouldn't be. Like I say, they just need better training on how to protect and how to serve in the community that they're working in before they come out there.
Yeah, and we just left our youth center, and there was probably 7 or 8 police officers from the 6th district there, and I think a lot of it is, our young people only see police officers when it's something terrible, or someone they love is going to jail, or it's someone who's talking to them in a loud manner, being disrespectful and cursing them out. And I think, again, if that's all you know, then there is a level of distrust. And so, again, people talk about community policing all the time, but it is important. I think it's important to be present in your community, to do events like tonight, to come out and not have your uniform on and play basketball. I think there where right now, unfortunately, it's so there's fear. I can't think of a harder job than being a police officer in New Orleans. It's got to be stressful and terrifying. It's also terrifying to be a young black man in New Orleans, sitting in front of your door, not knowing if you are going to be racially profiled and then put in a situation where you could be taken to jail. There could be something planted on you. So I think this distrust is something that if we don't actually have real dialogue and start recognizing that we need to come together, that we need to try to level the power dynamic that does exist. And we do need to get rid of the cops who are abusing that power. But I think, we've done a lot of community dialogues and conversations with our young people. We've done some fun role plays where the officers are not in uniform and they're talking. And when you can put yourself in the other person's shoes about, well, maybe as an officer, why did I respond like that? Or what was I fearful of? Just last week we had another horrific incident, which just continues to perpetuate, I think, this fear that then unfortunately labels so many young people, young black men who look like Darren, as a certain way, when really you're not going to meet anyone who's more kind, more respectful, more sweet than Darren. And so I think, again, we need to get beyond that, but it's going to take really hard conversations, and it's just going to take effort on all sides. But I think it's really on police officers, starts from the top, the leadership, but also the cops who are there every day, the B cops who are in the communities, to make sure that they're modeling and that they're earning the respect, because a lot of that just doesn't exist. And there have been a lot of kids who've been hurt and who've been taken to jail wrongfully, and who honestly they've been talked to really disrespectfully. And I think that that's something that we have a lot of work that we have to do. But it's a really important conversation.
Thank you so much for this panel. Sharing their time and talent this evening. Great conversation. Thank you, Ray Taylor from the Department of Criminology and Justice, for doing such a wonderful job moderating. And thank you so much for coming out tonight to listen and discuss this very important topic in New Orleans. Next spring, we're going to be having 3 new programs, and we're talking about civic engagement. We're going to be talking about the economy and the difficulty of getting by in an expensive place like New Orleans. Thank you.